That's just to allow the AGM delegates who have made good time, and instead of finishing at 11:30, I'm told they're going to be finishing in a couple of moments. So they're going to come and join us for this talk, hopefully in a couple of minutes' time. I'm going to introduce our speaker, so Paul Smith. Thank you for being with us and sharing with us. You've been an elder, full-time elder, at Grace Church in Broadstairs since 2017. Spent a bit of time in the States before that as well, studied history at Cambridge. Thank you for coming and talking to us about the history of the association. We look forward to it. Over to you.
Well, I want you to imagine the 150 years of the association as a great long timeline. Now, I'm imagining this morning that because you're here, you're probably connected to the association in some way. And at some point, your journey linked in to the journey of the association. So for me, I've got one link in that I come from a church in Broadstairs that joined the association in 1988. So it took a while, but eventually came on in. Your church will have that kind of date. And personally, you have a time that you personally joined the church that you're in or became connected to the association. Now, I had the privilege, Andrew King invited me to look at the history. I just want to say three things before I move into looking at it. The first thing is this, that what I've looked at is a minute's history. So I've been reading sometimes with great difficulty, handwritten minutes and then typed minutes and then other minutes. And as I was looking through, I was looking for predominantly two things. First, what keeps happening? That must be important. And then what is very unusual and really stands out? That's probably going to be important. I was looking at those two things. The second thing I'd like to say is this is an independent history. I haven't had anyone say, you must say this or you mustn't say that. So I'm a Grace Baptist by conviction, not by history. So I'm a full-time elder of a Grace Baptist church, been there 4 years, but that's not my background. So I don't know. I know maybe your family have been intermarried in Grace Baptist and Strict Baptist for the last 150 years. I'm guessing there's probably some people like that. That's not me, so I don't have any kind of secret axe to grind from some family history, at least none that I'm aware of. And the third thing is that I'm trying to make this a positive history. So I'm not suggesting that there's kind of major skeletons in the association's cupboard that I'm covering up. But equally, I'm not doing what often is done today, is you just try and find the most scandalous or divisive bits and then just kind of really raise those up. And so particularly you'll see over the last few years, maybe 30 years, although I'm being able to read minutes, not just from the public minutes of the AGM, but from the committee, the closer I've got to the current day, the less I've mentioned of known names or committee, because I don't feel that's appropriate. You know, like our nation would have a 30, 35-year rule and just say, well, look at that later. I don't think we're at the point to make historical judgments over that. Now, you will see, if you do buy this book, I've written a longer chapter there of history. You've got a little snippet in the booklet. And what I didn't want to do was either read this out or read out from the booklet, because I trusted your ability to read this morning. So what I do want to do is go over things in three ways. The first thing I'd like to do is look at a broad overview of the association, drawing out some major themes. Secondly, I just want to step through a second overview in looking at a timeline and just looking at some key events. And thirdly, I'm going to look at some snapshots, and I'm going to pull up some of the things that I've been reading. Some of those things are significant, some of those things were just interesting to me. And then hopefully there'll be some time if you want to ask any questions as well towards the end. Well, let's start off then. We're asking, why have we lasted so long? That's my big question, and this is the first part of overview. I'm suggesting there's 4 themes that I picked up on that helped the association last 150 years. And just follow down that first column there, that The association is from those who are seeking fellowship. Now, coming from the coast in Broadstairs, I really appreciated one of the early illustrations. There was a man called J.T. Briscoe who was tasked with giving a lecture on illustrative preaching. This is what he said about the association. That before the association, the churches had resembled little pools left by the ebbing tide, separate from each other, with no channel of communication. The association had formed a channel, but they needed to be overflowed with the divine influence. So it's a channel, otherwise you've got these pools, nice in and of themselves, but there's no link between them. Now the association was born in the 1870s in London. Now, strict Baptists had tried to form associations and they'd lasted only a few years. They'd fallen out over this, that, or the other. And they were having another go. And they seemed to be a bit jealous because some of the strict Baptists had gone into an association with that scandalous open Baptist Spurgeon. And they wanted to have their own association. So they set about forming it. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get as many of the strict Baptists from London to come together. They don't want to be independent. These were associational people. That was kind of the first 50 years. They try and get as many strict Baptists as they can together. But by the end of the time of the First World War, they start to have a much more outwards look, and particularly by the time you get through the interwar years to the Second World War, you kept reading of a push to try and get more and more and more strict Baptists together. So if you had these meetings, you wouldn't have been inviting someone over from America. You'd have been inviting someone over to speak probably from the Norfolk and Suffolk Association. So you can get that association and this association, and can you form a national association? And then more recently, the last 50 years, they then went outward even further, and they said, right, we're already associating as Grace Baptists now nationally. You've got the GBA, but we want to have association with evangelicals more widely. So there was a big push towards the British Evangelical Council, as it was, an affinity. And in fact, the association helped fund the house for the director of the British Evangelical Council. So there's this kind of push out, and you kept seeing this as you read through the minutes more and more and more. These were people, and we're people, who want to associate together on different levels as much as possible. Fellowship-seeking people. But the second question is, why have we lasted so long? There was an awful lot of very practical people. So early on, they're into London. Now, London, if we go back to 1850, London church attendance was really quite poor. The country's church attendance was 21%, 35%. London's was only 21%. So build churches, and they provided the money to do it. They were very, very practical. And they're very practical. There wasn't any welfare state. What would the widows do? Money. Work together, provide for the widows. They were very practical. By the time we get to post-World War II, I'll come on to this more in a minute, again, very practical. We want to plant churches. Let's work together on that with the finances. And then more recently, if you look at the last 50 years, as kind of compliance has increased and all kind of policies have come about, and very large resources that the association now has at its disposal, the association has seen again and again, and we'll see examples of practical stewardship of those things. They were very practical. Now, for the ones a little bit more controversial, principled people. When the association was formed, why was it formed? It's because people had certain distinctive historical, doctrinal positions. The one that we'll all know about, the Metropolitan Association of Strict Baptist Churches, is it's those who hold a strict view of communion. There was obviously particular Baptists, that included Spurgeon, but there were strict Baptists who believed that only those who'd been baptized members should be having communion. But there was something else which united this bunch of strict Baptists, which was that they did not like duty faith. You say, what is duty faith? Well, duty faith, they said, saving faith is not a legal duty, but the sovereign and precious gift of God. So essentially, there was something in the original statement of faith that was adamantly opposed to an open offer of the gospel to everyone. That is one thing that was really important to some of the early people in our association. It was a clause that was strongly promoted. It was there. But they weren't quite as hyper-Calvinist as other people, because then they said there is a duty to preach the gospel to everybody. So you say, well, you've got a duty to preach the gospel to everybody, but it's not a duty for everybody to believe. There's this kind of slight mismatch, and there's a slight tension there. But they strongly held this against other people. And they strongly stood against downgrade with Spurgeon. They've got this, we're going to stand on these fundamentals. As you go through the 20s, liberalism's rampant, the association stands, deity of Christ, scriptures, adds to their doctrinal basis, stands strongly. And what do you see? A lessening focus on duty faith. So they're still going to stand on the fundamentals, but they're not quite so sure that duty faith is a fundamental. And then it comes on today, again, wanting to stand for truth, but maybe he doesn't want to draw those lines quite as sharply. Finally, spreading the faith. From the very start, this was strong. The early days, they talk about we want to establish causes, we want to be building churches. I said that in London, 21% were church-going in 1850, but that was up to 30% by 1900. Strict Baptist churches were being built, the home mission was being launched. You might say, why are they getting involved in home mission when they're anti-duty faith? I'd love to have asked them that question, but it seems that their practice was better than their theology. After World War II, or after World War I, sorry, increasing evangelism, and possibly the high point coming in that central thing of joint evangelism, and that's continued to the present day. But those were four themes that I saw coming out, going through, that kind of spanned all of the periods that kind of summed the association up. So the second thing we're going to look at is just a quick overview of some key dates. Some key dates. So, 23 churches launch. Peak 1901. Similar number of churches to today, but about double the membership. It never got beyond that. By 1904, they're launching home mission. The duty faith clause is still there, but they want to preach the gospel. 1907, they've got the incorporation, they've got the company. Interesting one, districts launched in 1917. Now, some of you may know about this. I've not seen this happening recently, but I discovered an association Sunday, where one Sunday a year, districts used to organise pulpit swaps, and there used to be some prayer and giving, an annual event. Does anyone know that in recent memory? Recently? Okay. Maybe in some districts that was quite big. Fellowship of Youth comes 1934 to stem the leakage of young after Sunday school, but involved in youth evangelism. Let me just highlight this. I want to come on to this more as an example in a minute. Orthodoxy is shown. Key one, 1952, the area changes. Why did they want to change the area, the size of the association? Answer: for evangelism, for church planting. After World War II, the government's building these new estates, and they wanted to plant in Basildon. It wasn't in the area, so what do? We'll change the area. Some of you who know London better than me might understand why they wanted to make the central point Charing Cross rather than St Paul's. But they slightly tweaked the centre, and then they tweaked the area and said, can we fit this in? Yes, we can get a church plant. Let's go for this. 1962, it expanded to the current stage. 1970, it's becoming broader. So it's had this very distinctively strict Baptist publication called the Gospel Herald. That goes, Grace Magazine comes. Other significant thing by then, a general secretary paid part-time, Jack Hodes. Another significant one, 1974, with the complications of all the governance and so on, more power is going to the decision-making going to the executive. 1978, finally, they drop the clause on duty faith. Now, interestingly, when the clause on duty faith is dropped, I think 1978, they've planted churches with people who are preaching an open offer of the gospel, while on their doctrinal basis it says no duty faith. So when it's dropped, it's dropped with seemingly little fuss. Again, Jack Hode was involved with that, and then one church tried to get this back in, and they couldn't find a single seconder in the AGM to get this clause back in. So it's something that's just been there, and you always feel that these people haven't understood it. I mean, even the Strict Baptist Mission had this in there. It was a common clause. But it's gone, 1978. Name change, there, and doctrinal basis there. Let me now come to some examples. So let's have a look at some particular examples, snapshots from what is going on. So earlier on in the association life, they used to produce data like this, and I think it's be fascinating to have today. Can you imagine if your church had to list precisely how much money it had given each year down to the last penny, so the other churches could look and say, oh, are we giving a bit too much? They're a bit stingy, aren't they? That's all listed there. You can also see the size of the churches. So one of the early presidents in Clerkenwell, John Hazelton, very large church, 316 members. And they get listing scholars, those in their Sunday school. That was a really important thing, right through to the time of church planting in just after World War II. They'd be listing, we've got this many teachers, we've got this many people in the Sunday school. Really, really important. So you can list that, you can see that through the years. Also look, you can see there a chap called W.J. Stiles, one of the early pastors, been trained by Spurgeon. He's written one of the most hyper-Calvinist works ever, probably in 1907. And it's interesting, Stiles was really fighting, and he was frustrated because young men were growing up who weren't anti-duty faith. So possibly the fact Stiles was fighting so strongly, even in the early years, and then he left, he had been training young ministers, suggests that a lot of the ministers just couldn't help themselves offering the gospel. Because otherwise, why are you fighting so hard and getting so frustrated? So Stiles. This is something early on, I find this fascinating because of our kind of debates recently. I'm not saying this is vastly significant in association. I find it fascinating to me. This is when the Queen Victoria decided to have some friendly relations with the Pope. This really got the AGM very, very steamed up. And being so steamed up that they said it on this bit here, you probably can't read, it's a bit small. Because of this, they had serious doubts in the minds of Her Majesty's subjects as to whether they are absolved of their allegiance. So they're basically saying, this is a Protestant constitution, you vary from that, you're not our queen. And we think we're kind of from a conservative association, but that's pretty hardcore. That's the kind of strength of their views, and again, the AGM, they'd be wanting to make statements and write to politicians and write to people because they felt things very, very strongly. This is standing on the fundamentals. Very significant time when they start to have the home mission. This is 1902. I know it happened in 1904, but it took a couple of years to get there. Now, this just gives us an indication of the type of pastors that they had. Again, you might not be able to see this, but in number 8 there, it talks about a church has been formed, there's a pastor doing good work, but is hindered in his efforts through business ties, the church doing its utmost, being unable to entirely support such a pastor, grants be made at the discretion of the committee. So you're getting not an association of just all full-time men, but a lot of part-time men and part-time men planting churches, or possibly even full-time working and planting churches, and they're saying we need to support them. Notice here as well that it's very much establishment of strict Baptist churches and of a cause. They were very, very keen on getting their distinctives in certain areas. Here's another example of them standing on fundamentals. 1907, George Bernard Shaw preached and said there is not a single established religion in the world in which an intelligent or educated man could believe. So there's George Bernard Shaw, and this is a time when lots of other people are going woolly. The association says this is non-historic, number one, unscriptural and insulting to the person and derogatory to the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. They're absolutely adamant they're going to stand very, very firmly. Let's move on to 1925. Again, we're thinking about pastoral training. I'm taking this now from the Gospel Herald, the official publication, which the AGM, generally the discussion was, the Gospel Herald hasn't got enough money, we need to have more subscribers, and we desperately need more subscribers. This is our official publication, we need this publication, can you please subscribe, we're running out of money, can we bail it out? No, we shouldn't bail it out, we need more subscribers. This was interminable AGM discussions. So it's a very, very important publication to them, and it had some kind of official sense to it, it seems. Now, someone arguing strongly, and this was highlighted in the AGM, and it's saying, how have so few of our preachers availed themselves of the strict Baptist Institute? Christ is worthy of the best and demands the best. Does anyone say there is no need of human learning, for example, of grammatical speech, the proper construction of sentences, or the ability to read the New Testament in the original Greek? So the 1920s, you've got this thing happening in the UK. The denominations are going liberal. Learning is generally liberal. The Brethren are surviving by not sending anyone to university and going slightly fundamentalist in the sense of anti-learning. Now, the strict Baptists are saying we're going to stand firmly on fundamentals, but we need to be educated as well. It's an interesting note for the 1920s. If you look at the history of the 1920s, I've not seen too much of that reading in different elsewhere. I've seen a lot of stuff on learning, and I've seen a lot of stuff on standing strong, but to have both of those is quite interesting to have that. These are all snapshots. 1931. The association, again and again and again, kept protesting about the liberalisation of the Sunday trading laws and the Sunday entertainment laws. And it's interesting where they got steamed up from. They got steamed up from the Sunday School Committee, because the big thing they wanted was young people to hear the gospel. That was where it's predominantly coming. So when they write again, 1931, against the Sunday opening of theatres and music halls, and it says here, it's calculated to encourage the rising generation in Sabbath breaking. That is the focus. What's the problem? The rising generation in Sabbath breaking. And one thing that I was reflecting on was this. Some people say, well, should we protest on social legislation, kind of legacy Christian social legislation? We can have different views on that, and that's fine. But they have fought it for year in, year out, year in, year out, year in, year out. And you hear testimonies, don't you, of people who've been converted either through Sunday school or when some seeds planted in Sunday school, and later on they hear gospel preaching. One question I asked myself was, how many people were converted because people fought on this thing and they slowed down the rate? We'll never know that, but it's just interesting. It was a big thing for the association. I mean, this stuff came up again and again and again and again. They were always protesting about liberalisation. To give you, this is a slightly more amusing anecdote from 1931. Now, I don't know who's been counting votes today, but would this be in the minutes? The secretary reported in 1931 several irregularities had occurred in the counting of votes in the election of the committee. The minute secretary made a recount, inspected the methods of arriving at the total votes. Mr. F.M. Hill was declared elected at the half-yearly meeting. On the recount was found not to be so elected. It's an absolute shocker. So 1931, electoral commission involved. But then they resolved it. Owing to the withdrawal of Mr. T. Robinson, it was resolved that Mr. F.M. Hill's name be retained, and he is hereby declared elected. So there we are. accounting issues. So that's 1931. That's a kind of more humorous thing, but also to give you a more heartfelt thing from 1931. The president, or a past president, I think the guy H.D. Took, was dying. So they stop the AGM and they send a telegram. Pastors and delegates send loving greetings and united earnest prayers, 1 Peter 5, 10 and 11. So you've got this there's a tender side to them. Sometimes they seem very hard because they're fighting on things, and you get this, then the very, very tender side, sending telegrams out from the AGM. Another thing which I found very interesting, looking at the history, was the structure, the way it used to be. So there used to be two meetings. There was a half-yearly meeting and an AGM. Don't know if any of you are old enough to remember those two meetings. I'm guessing possibly some of you. So the AGM used to take place in April, or March, April time, and the half-yearly meeting in October. Eventually they switched those and then dropped the half-yearly meeting. They had a fascinating way of working out how they were led. They weren't led initially by a chairman, they were led by a president. So what you do at the half-yearly meeting, you get some names put forward. It's a bit like a kind of a Tory party leadership election. You put some names forward, and then from the half-yearly meeting, you need to whittle them down, this list of names, until you get two names. And then those two names need to get put forward to the AGM, and from those two names, you get a vice president. He serves a year and then becomes the president the next year. But you can get a kind of sense of rising stars. So Ernest Kevin, he might suddenly start making the last two, or he gets on the list, and you can kind of see these names. First you get on the list, then you get to the last two, and then finally hit the jackpot and hit presidency. So you've got this kind of quite interesting. Now, even more interesting to me as well, in terms of electing the committee made of pastors and delegates, and they kept tweaking the rules, how many pastors, how many delegates, and all this kind of stuff. But they used to list committee attendance. Can you imagine this? This is quite interesting. So they say, we'll give you the number of meetings you've attended. So you see there, you've got Ernest Kevin there. A little cross denotes a certain time period where there were 6 meetings. Kevin has made 6 out of 6, and he was duly re-elected. Some other people, Clark there, he's only made 1. He's still re-elected, but other people not re-elected. So they've got this kind of statistical thing that comes up. They're quite into their detail on this, which makes me all the more fascinating that they couldn't count the votes, because they're so interested in all of this intricate numbers. And there were contested elections. I mean, again, I'm guessing the AGM today there wasn't a huge contest in committee things, but these are contested elections. You've got more names than places, and these are positions which are sought. One of the key men in the association, the General Secretary, unpaid, quarter of a century General Secretary, a chap called William Baker. Now this man has a massive impact. And I just wanted to pick out 2 things from him. One thing, think about 1936. You're thinking about the rise of Hitler. You're thinking about Stalin in control. You're thinking about this country in deep economic problems. He says this: at a time when forces are at work in the world which are beyond the control of statesmen, it behoves us to keep in our minds we must occupy till he comes. It's quite a strong word, that. Occupy. It's a kind of a strong, resolved word. But he also had amazing financial savvy, now, and boldness. Now, there was a chapel called Little Wild Street, and the Little Wild Street chapel was closed before the association existed. Okay, so it's a historic Grace Baptist Church, or Street Baptist Church, but it was closed before the association existed. Stiles hears it's being sold, and he comes in with a claim. He says, we have the same theology as them, therefore we should get some money, even though it closed before we existed. And I think I've just lost the name. what's the other holding trustees who even hold my church as trustees? And I've lost the name. I got it on my mind. Grace Bible Church Corporation. I think they were in with Styles. And Styles managed to wangle a third of the proceeds of this church. Now, it was only worth 11,871. That's a third of the proceeds. In today's money, that's £500,000. Styles pulled that off. Now, you didn't just pull that off. Then they were saying, well, yeah, but you've got to spend the money in the parish. And Styles is like, that's ridiculous. We can spend the money right across London. And they said, okay. That legacy is still in play. Now, Styles, and if you pick up this, I've listed some of the initial things that money was used for. But he was a man that greatly appreciated. So he was a spiritual man, but he was also a practical man. Over 25 years as honorary general secretary. And once he goes, they start to think we need to have some kind of permanent replacement because we can't get people like that. Let me come to another example, 1936 as well. Now, I said that the association was stood on fundamentals. Now, one thing it seems that they utterly fudged in their original doctrinal basis was the deity of, or aspect of the deity of Christ, certainly eternal sonship. There was a big debate historically, I won't go into it now, into whether Christ was eternally the Son of God, whether he just became the Son incarnationally, and so on. But look at that for a statement. Number one on the left. The equality and distinct personality of the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. I mean, they hadn't even got the word Son in the statement of faith. So the gospel standard was onto them. And in 1936, the Gospel Standard dredged up an old copy of the Gospel Heralds, which had been a magazine, which had been a strict Baptist magazine that the association had bought. Now, this is from when it had been written before it had been bought by the association. And it described eternal sonship as a piece of twaddle. Obviously, that is fairly provocative. So the association, by 1936, whatever happened I imagine, statements of faith there, aren't they? They're to unite people and to rule other things out. So obviously in 1871, they couldn't unite everyone they wanted in the association with a very clear statement on eternal sonship. So they got that, and they said, okay, well, that's the Trinity, we're okay, we won't fight on this, because they were associational. But by 1936, they said, right, we're going to nail this one once and for all. This is a time, again, of liberalism, and you can see they didn't just kind of slightly tweak it. They just decided to underline it, nail it, and say, look, you're not going to throw this old accusation at us. In the fullness of time, setting one, God sent forth his Son, ever consisting in essential deity, and so on. So when challenged, they were prepared to really underline it. They slotted in a very strong statement on the scriptures as well, and they put another one in on the second coming when they were challenged. This is anecdotal, snapshot. You say, what were they singing? If you get your program out. I always went through the 1930s and 40s and thought, what are they singing? Have these songs survived? The three on the left, I thought, well, I think we'd all know those today. And the three on the left, maybe not. We wouldn't necessarily know thoroughly as well all the other songs on the right. But that's the kind of stuff that was meaningful to the association in the 1930s and 40s. It's also mentioned in the longer version, they had some discussions about new hymn books. Ever been in a hymn book controversy? After one hymn book controversy, they surveyed the churches who were for the hymn book, and they were for making a new hymn book, but they didn't say they were going to actually use it. But they're always debating this. Often, interestingly, they wanted hymns to use in the open air in evangelistic rallies, while they've got something to say they can't offer the gospel because there's no duty faith. This is the time when the association was probably, from reading the minutes, the most excited, the most prayerful, the most energized. This was when they got involved in church planting together. This is probably, I would say, the most excited and spiritually excited, it seems, from the minutes that they got. So you can see them there. Freyans, am I saying that right? I spoke to a member. Is that Freyans? Is that okay? Right. You can shout out what you want. Basildon. they've planted this church. They're getting reports at the AGM that they're thrilled by this. And eventually they go for the stone laying century. You see this kind of cooperation. You've got the presidents laying a stone. You've got the Strict Baptist Federation. You've got Pastor Phillimore, a major person. Many people talked about Phillimore as being a kind of key kind of guy. And you've got coach loads of people going from districts. You imagine that, it's a coach load going to this time. And then they go at the same time, they're very strict Baptists, so I think they say something like, we're going to hold a communion service, by the way, we're all going to be strict Baptists at the communion service, so don't worry. But this is a time of great excitement, and they also went in George Pibworth, another church planter, Gadebridge. So there's this huge excitement post-World War II. The association comes together, works together, plants these churches. They're absolutely thrilled to do so, and they help them financially. And then you're getting these reports, and are they going to be financially sufficient? Yes, they are. They're talking about the Sunday school and so on. I think Phillimore went round, and he said, I went round every single house, and I knocked on the door and I spoke to them. And I couldn't find any real Christians, and in a few years there's a functioning church. This is kind of like raw church planting. I know there's different ways you can plant churches, but this was very much kind of like we go in and preach the gospel, we see the results. 1963, just to give you an example of, again, annual meetings back then. Interesting thing they have there, the London and Southern Strict Baptist Choir. They got quite excited about a choir at one point. Again, you can, just something to note there as well, they talk about different people from different places. You've got Pastor J.K. Thorpe from the Suffolk and Norfolk Association, and Pastor G.W. Bourne, delegate from the Cambridge and East Midlands Union. And at that time, there's a phrase that was used very often, the strict Baptist denomination. There's a very strong sense. You know, today we kind of might talk about Grace Baptist circles, which is is that kind of quite warm and fuzzy and kind of inclusive and kind of overlapping. There's a bit more of there's a strict Baptist denomination with a bit more parallel lines, but a very strong sense of association. And just to say that they weren't just saying we're an association, but we want to associate with other strict Baptist associations. So just a few anecdotes there. I'm just gonna recap. Why have we lasted so long? First reason, because we're fellowship people. We know we're stronger together than in our isolated congregations. Second, we're sharing funds. That when one church is stronger, they've helped other churches that are weaker. And you can see that throughout the history that has worked extremely well. We've stood on fundamentals when other churches have gone into downgrade. Very, very strong. Inerrancy of Scripture, deity of Christ, stood strong. And spreading the faith, you can see there from the very outset in London, there was a church planting focus. Home mission from an early date. Massive church planting moves after World War II onto church planting revitalisation today. So they've not just kind of had this insularity, but they've also had this going out and church planting focus. So that's a bit of a potted history. I didn't want to just repeat those of you who've come in. I just said at the start, I didn't want to just repeat what I'd said at greater length in the book, but that's the kind of overview. And I'm happy to take a couple of questions if anyone wants to ask any questions about anything I've said. Yes?
Well, thanks very much. We were just drawing up our church history. Just another thing.
Can you say which church you're from? Sorry.
Newtown Baptist Church of Cheshire.
Okay.
Another thing they got steamed up from a national point of view was the some of the education acts that they felt favoured the church building. Was there anything of that association wide or not? Did you read anything about that?
Yes, I did. I might have even read some from your church at that point. You're talking about the, is it 90? It's the 19 about 03, 04. Yes, I did. Yeah, they were steamed up about it. It was only protested about, but it was at that time and not particularly afterwards. I think I wrote a bit about that in the Evangelical Times recently, so a bit more detail on that. Yeah, go on.
What would you say was the biggest threat to the association over the last 50 years?
The biggest threat to the association?
Yeah, whether external or internal.
They would have said, let's say the first 75 years, they would have said the biggest threat from reading would be departing from the faith once for all delivered to the saints, and they took quite a maximal view of that. So they would have said if they departed from their ecclesiology, then they would go, they would fall. But we must, there's a phrase they used, we must stand apart. That's what they just said the first 75 years, the greatest threat. The last 75 years, I think would be, just from reading what's going on in a number of churches, I think how they responded to demographic change, because they were a London association, and there's a lot of changes. If you look at 1916, you've become very, very big. Can they keep together? And can they respond to the huge changes? Because there's a metropolitan association. That's what. But I'd be less conclusive for the last 50 years, because I think you might have to go on another 20, 30 years before making a fully reasoned judgment on that. But that's my judgment. I'm not happy to. That's more of an opinion. Yeah. Anyone else? Pass back to Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was insightful, and isn't it wonderful to see folk from these churches that we've seen up on the screen, churches that by the Lord's grace are still going today. Well, we've got another break now, another comfort break. Can I ask you to be back in your seats promptly at 12 noon? Just a reminder, there's refreshments, there's a bookstall, and if you haven't yet, pick up your free copy of that book that Paul was referring to, One Per Church. Great. Back in seats at 12, please.